Mike, thanks for coming on the program. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Campbell. This is a long time in the making. I'm glad we could finally make it happen.
I think first and foremost, if you can introduce yourself, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Mike Mignano. I'm one of the co-founders of Anchor, and I now work at Spotify after Spotify acquired Anchor back in February of 2019. I basically run the team that looks after products like Anchor and also products like Spotify for podcasters, basically all of the podcaster tools that Spotify builds and maintains.
You you totally rode the wave of podcasting beautifully. Like, if you kind of look at the time and place you were in, you were discovering podcasts in 2014. You mentioned Serial was blowing up. That's when I started listening to Startup and a bunch of Gimlet shows too.
Yep.
And so as a result, like there's you can have a great idea and a great product, but many great ideas and great products are kind of ideas that have occurred many times over. And I've noticed it's really about the timing and of course great execution on top of that timing. And so when you originally had this idea, was it the easiest way to make a podcast, or was it like this audio social network? What was your ambition? Because ideas change. And so just talk about that.
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about that. I just want to, before that, I want to comment on the timing thing. I mean, I think that is such an important point that I certainly didn't realize earlier on and only realize it now in retrospect, that market timing is maybe the biggest determinant of whether or not a startup will be successful. Yeah, I think it's interesting you pick up on that because, we definitely did not have the right market timing in the beginning, in the early days of Anchor, nor were we trying to nail the timing. We were just excited about something. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But to your question about the social product, it was not what it is today. It was not this all-inclusive, super easy to use, podcasting platform that you could do all from your phone or your desktop and wind up on every major consumption platform. It was a social platform, and I think that speaks to what I was saying earlier around how we really wanted to solve sort of like both sides of the market. Like we saw issues on both sides, and we felt that we could tackle both sides. I think what we learned pretty quickly that while we were having success getting people to create the content, we were struggling getting people to listen to it in our platform on Anchor. Mm-hmm. It was really just like record, listen back, publish. Yeah. The product had evolved to a point where the content early days was very, very short form and lightweight. But by the time we had this realization, it actually did kind of feel like a podcast. It was longer form. It was richer and more substantive in terms of production quality. So the only difference really was that it wasn't available on places like Spotify and Apple.
Yeah. And you weren't branding it as a podcast. Correct.
We weren't branding it as a podcast. So I think that's when we realized we're actually doing a disservice to the creators here. Mm-hmm. It would be much more beneficial to them and probably to us if we actually open this thing up and push this content out to where people were listening. And that's really where the current value prop of Anchor was born.
So in between, we have Anchor V1, which is like social, and then Anchor V2, which is much more of like a podcast distribution platform, the easiest way to make a podcast. In between those two waves, they often call where you're working on a startup but you haven't found product market fit, they call that the Trough of sorrow, where the gears kind of just aren't clicking. Did you ever get discouraged? Were you ever kind of like looking around wondering why you weren't the next Facebook in the early days for V1?
Yeah, I mean the Trough of sorrow is definitely a term I've heard as well, and I think in my experience working on Anchor and other founders I've talked to, I think there are many or multiple troughs of sorrow. The early days of a startup, and you said you're at an early stage startup, so maybe you can relate to this. It definitely feels like a bit of a roller coaster, right? Where one day you're at a high, and then the next day you're at like a really deep low, and it sort of ebbs and flows like that, right? You have these big wins, big successes. Maybe you score like a big deal or a surge of new users or something, and then maybe maybe a few months go by and nobody's using your product anymore, and you're sort of wondering what the heck's happening. So can totally relate to the trough of sorrow, and definitely went through not just one of those. I think many of those. I think we had one fairly right out of the gate, in that when we launched the first version of Anchor, the more social version, there was a lot of excitement around it. There was a lot of attention. There was a lot of press. There was a lot of investor interest. There was a lot of acquisition interest. Literally within the first
acquisition
couple of weeks.
interest.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Literally within the first couple of weeks. And I think
Oh my
I know
God.
that sounds crazy. And I think it's because Anchor, like a social audio platform, not that nobody had ever tried social audio before, but for whatever reason, I think that struck a nerve with a lot of people, especially in like the Silicon Valley sort of tech community. I think it excited a lot of people. It was different than what everyone had just seen for the past couple of years, that was so squarely focused on photos and videos. And it brought in this rush of attention and engagement. High profile investors and celebrities and things like this using the product. And so in those early days, you're like, oh wow, we made it. We did it. But we were also extremely, I think, willing to ship fast and iterate and learn. And we were not precious at all about what we were doing. I don't think, maybe never in the history of the company did we become so attached to any one product idea or initiative. We were just constantly sort of like searching for the perfect product market fit. Yeah. So even when it stopped working, we just kept iterating and kept following the user feedback. And it's funny, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but we launched the first version of Anchor, say in like March or something like that.
Of which year?
2016.
Okay.
And based on that initial excitement, we immediately decided that we needed to invest in an Android app. And so we hired this guy who was an amazing Android engineer and amazing member of our team. And he raced to build an Android app.
Oh no!
It took him a few months.
Yeah.
But during those months is when we realized that iteration of Anchor was not working. So literally right after we shipped Android, honestly within weeks, we decided we were sunsetting the version 1 of Anchor and moving on to the next one. That was a really, really painful moment for all of us.
And in 2019, you merged with Spotify. They announced they acquired two companies, Gimlet and Anchor. Both of them I've consumers and users of. And so I'm guessing you've heard the startup in regards to Gimlet's acquisition, Thanksgiving in Stockholm. And unfortunately, that's all I have to reference. And I'm sure it was different in your situation. But did you have an infamous meeting with Daniel Ek? Did you go to Stockholm and meet with him? And did he grill you about the future of Anchor?
So I was in a really fortunate position to start building a relationship with Daniel early on in the history of Anchor. Again, back to early days Anchor when it was a social product, and definitely getting a lot of interest and excitement from people. Daniel was one of the people that reached out to me early on, and we just formed a relationship over our mutual interest in product and audio, and we both have young families. So we stayed in touch on and off throughout the year. So when it did come time to discussing an acquisition, it wasn't like there was this one big intense meeting that where we were getting grilled.
The day after the acquisition, what happens? I'm curious.
The day after the acquisition.
Yeah.
Man, that whole time is a blur, if I'm being totally honest. Leading up to the acquisition, I'm sure you've heard this before. It's a pretty intense process. There's there's diligence, there's paperwork, there's a lot of phone calls with lawyers, all the while you're running a business, right? Because if an acquisition doesn't go through for whatever reason, you got to keep things moving. So I wasn't getting a lot of sleep at that time, and some of the details are a little fuzzy. But I will say that because of the alignment, it was kind of, let's get back to work. it's not to say we just picked up the very next day. Obviously, we had to inform the team. We had to really wrap our heads around what it meant to be a part of Spotify, go through onboarding and things like that, meet a lot of people, a couple of trips to Stockholm. But given the alignment of vision and missions, like it was a very much like, okay, how do we get back to work but do it bigger and better now?
Yeah.
We initially stayed in our original office, so it wasn't like everything looked and felt differently overnight. We've since moved offices. We're now in the Spotify office, although right now we're not in any office because everyone's working remotely due to COVID. But I think it was if you've talked to people whose startups have been acquired, I'm sure you've heard horror stories about integrations and people forcing others to work different ways and culture shock and all these sorts of things. We never really had that because there was so much alignment up front, and we sort of gradually merged the teams. Like I said, we were originally in our own office. Then we ended up sort of over time going down there, and so I don't know. I wish I could say that there was like a very distinct moment or feeling on that day after, but it was more. I would think it was more gradual and very, very positive all around.
Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Great to get to talk to you.
Campbell, likewise. This was awesome. Great meeting you, and can't wait to hear the podcast.